Well, it starts off pretty basic with the beams, and you have to make sure they're straight. The longer the house, the harder that is. I like to use at least a 6x6 for my perimeter beam, and we do an overlap joint. So you don't want to be split, you don't want to be cracked, you don't want a lot of knots. And if you can do it, ideally, you want to have longleaf pine. So that's the start. The first component is a good beam.
On the houses we just did, one is 11 by 17, the other one's 8 by 11, and we actually did 4 by 6s rather than 6 by 6s. So a little different than that, but I think they'll be plenty strong.
A really small house doesn't have a lot of weight or load to bear. On a bigger house, like some of the bigger ones we build in the 30, 32-foot range, it's really important to have the bigger beam.
And the other thing you need to start is to have an elevated platform. Now, around here, we've got some little tree trunk looking things where they have 4 legs sticking out and a post sticking up about, what are they, about 16 to 18 inches. And then the beams rest on those. We can shim under those to create a level playing field to build the whole house on. If you're building it at home, you could just build foundations, build the footings, and then start from there. Essentially, the beams run mainly the perimeter. There's one down the middle in the 11 by 17 house. You didn't have a center one, did you, in yours? And then the joists are just 2 by 6 that connect from the center beam to the outer beams.
In this case, actually, we use ledgers underneath the 2 by 6s that are underneath the floor. The ledgers are actually put into the side of the beam in the sense that they're screwed, nailed, and glued. And they're generally, if you want to do it right, 6 lines per inch, growth lines per inch, to 13 growth lines per inch. So they're structurally extremely hard, extremely dense, and they'll carry a good load. They carry the load of the 2 by 6s, which that way are embedded inside of the beams instead of sitting on top of them, which uses up an additional 5.5 inches otherwise.
And actually the joists are notched at each end so that they interface with that ledger and create this really tight structure. Well, it provides this rigidity so that when you walk across the floor, there's a 2 by 6 structure under you. Yeah, essentially blocking is just short pieces that go between the joists, and they keep the joists from lying over or twisting out from under. That's their main function. Well, basically the subfloor is kind of like the membrane that ties the whole assembly together. And that's got subfloor glue on it as well.
We staple that, we shoot it down with ring shank nails. It's laid diagonally, it's kind of like a wind brace, in other words, so it keeps it from twisting or torquing. And it's what we nail the floor into later. So it's 3/4 inch thick, solid lumber, which is not plywood or something else. The benefit of that is that if there were ever to be a leak in the house or flood in the house, the water would run over the hardwood floor, and when it went down underneath the baseboards, it would run through the subfloor instead of getting caught like on plywood and causing puddling and molding underneath the floor. By using that solid lumber, it'll dry back out again, and it's also going to give it more strength.
I think one way of thinking of the subfloor is it's the structural floor. So the floor you actually walk on is not really, we're not considering that part of the structure, whereas the subfloor is integral to the structure of the house.
It generally does not have to be a high quality of lumber. It can have cracks in it or knots in it because it's not your impermeable layer. It's more a layer for grabbing onto the nails and holding them.
And usually we use 1 by. Now sometimes that's 3/4, yeah, 3/4, and sometimes thicker.
Well, my favorite floor to use is longleaf pine, which comes in a 3¼ inch or 5.5 inch width generally, sometimes in a 4¼ width. And we do a pre-lay in that case where we come through and look at all our pieces, clean them up, clean the dirt out of the tongues and grooves, check them out for damage, and then pre-lay out the floors if we're going to actually put it down. But at the first time we do it, we don't actually put any nails in it except at the very edge to hold the first one. We pack it all tight, make sure it's all going to fit, and then we go to the next step, which is to start putting it down. For that, we pull some up, and then we go ahead and nail it down.
And like on the floor in my house, that we didn't quite have all of the same stock. It started out with long leaf of varying thick widths. So from the top, looking at it, some was, I believe some was 3 1/4 and some was 2 1/2. So you could see a kind of differentiation. But then towards the end, we actually found some maple, and we incorporated the maple into about 3 feet of it. So there's not only is it thicker, but then the maple is thinner and of a different quality, a different character. And it creates kind of this cool tiger stripe effect. So I like it. We'll see how that kind of progresses through the house. I mean, essentially, you'd never want to, the wood floor is alive, and so you never want to pin it down at its junction. You want it to be able to live and breathe and move around. So the finished floor is trimmed in, and we'll cover that then with the exterior skins and the trim, the gap between the structural framing and the finished floor.
We actually had spacing joints inside of there, so when the wood swells because of humidity, it'll expand into the gaps we intentionally leave between some of the boards every 2 feet. Wood swells and contracts depending on the humidity in the air normally, although the wood we use for the floors, the longleaf pine, is the least impacted by that movement. Oak, maple, and pecan are also all hardwoods and much more affected by the difference in humidity. You really need to go ahead then and sand the tops of them. If the floor is new or old, it still needs a light sanding. If it's new or doesn't have a lot of varnish on it, or all the boards are even. But if it's not real even, he'll tell you because they had to do it.
Yeah, we had to take about, at least 3 passes. I think it was closer to 4 or 5 to even all that down, because they were coming out of different floors, and each floor has had a different life. Some have been buffed consistently, some have maybe never been touched. So that you get a variation in height that can be as much. I think there were places where we had 1/8 of an inch pretty consistently, and there were places where it was even a little higher. So yeah, so they took a lot of sanding to get that down.
Yeah, we actually oiled it early on the first time, before we ever put the walls up, before we ever put the rest of the house up. We actually put a coat of oil on there to seal it so that it doesn't absorb all the other things that might get spilled on it during construction. Then we come back and buff it out again, clean it up toward the end, and apply another coat of oil, at least, if not 2.